He forced a mafia don to execute his own son just for threatening his girl. When the Russo family threatened Emma, Alessandro Duca didn't just start a mob war. He orchestrated a masterpiece of psychological torture. To protect the woman he loves, he planted undeniable evidence that the rival boss's youngest son was stealing from the family. The result? The father brutally killed his own child. Alessandro wiped out his enemies without firing a single bullet himself. This is exactly what happens when you touch a mafia king's ultimate weakness. Picture the tragic opening to this underworld story, a scene drenched in the heavy scent of wet earth and absolute despair. We find our protagonist, Emma, kneeling in a storm that feels like a physical manifestation of her grief. The rain lashes against her black umbrella, ticking away the seconds of a nightmare she refuses to accept. She sits in the freezing mud before a slab of cold marble, totally numb to the chill because the pain has already moved into her bones. The stone reads Alejandro Victoria Duca, 1994 to 2025. She traces the carved letters with shaking fingers as her tears dissolve into the freezing downpour. It shows us a harsh life lesson. We often let our love blind us to the inevitable consequences of our dangerous choices. The marble feels like solid ice beneath her bare hands. It has been 6 agonizing months since the syndicate told her the love of her life perished in a massive warehouse explosion. Half a year since his shadowy associates handed her a sterile death certificate and a massive payout check she swore she would never touch. Her world has been stripped of all color. "I am sorry," Emma whispers to the empty graveyard, her voice cracking under the weight of survivor guilt. "I am so sorry I could not save you." But in that exact moment, the wind shifts. It carries the delicate scent of funeral lilies mixed with something heavy and familiar, rich leather, high-end cologne, and the distinct aura of underworld danger. Emma freezes, convinced her shattered mind is finally breaking down. Let us unpack this story together, because understanding how they met is crucial. Emma first collided with the infamous Alejandro Duca on the most exhausting night of her life. She was surviving a brutal double shift at an incredibly upscale restaurant, serving patrons who casually dropped her entire monthly rent on a single bottle of wine. Her feet were screaming, and all she wanted was the safety of her tiny apartment. Then, in a twist of cinematic fate, she walks directly into a solid wall of tailored Italian fabric. Time slows to a crawl as she struggles to balance a heavy silver tray of champagne. The crystal glasses tip, the golden liquid flies, and Emma realizes with absolute horror that she is about to ruin a total stranger $1,000 suit. But this man possesses the lightning reflexes of an apex predator. His hands shoot out, snatching the tray out of the air before a single drop taints his clothes. Emma looks up, falling instantly into the darkest eyes she has ever seen. We are talking pure midnight, carrying enough unspoken trauma to swallow a normal person whole. "Careful, Bellissima," he murmurs. His voice is a smoky velvet, carrying an accent that masks the inherent threat of his presence. Instantly, 2 massive bodyguards step up behind him, reaching into their jackets like they are ready to turn the room into a war zone. The entire restaurant drops into dead silence. The tragic irony here? Everyone in that room knew they were looking at the undisputed boss of the criminal underworld, except for Emma. In that fleeting moment, Emma is completely blind to the lethal world she just stumbled into. She simply sees a strikingly handsome stranger who saved her job. As he stabilizes the tray, his fingers graze her fragile wrist, sending an undeniable jolt of electricity up her arm. "Thank you," she breathes, a deep blush rising to her cheeks. "I am so sorry. I was not watching my step. The mafia boss dismisses the apology, studying her like a psychological puzzle he desperately wants to solve. "What is your name?" he interrupts. "Emma Carter," she replies. He tests the syllables like tasting a rare wine, then notes that she must be new. "I am still learning the layout," she admits. Feeling unnerved by his intense focus, he smoothly replies that she needs a guide, setting the trap. The smile he offers her is a masterclass in manipulation, carrying a dangerous edge. "Someone to show you where the treacherous spots are," he adds, turning a simple restaurant layout into a metaphor for survival. One of his enforcers steps close, whispering urgent syndicate business in rapid Italian, but Alejandro simply raises a single hand. He commands absolute obedience from a hardened criminal without even breaking eye contact with Emma. "I have to work," she stammers, fighting a sudden, irrational urge to abandon her life and follow him into the dark. And what does the king of the city do? "I will wait," he declares. He spends the entire night anchored at a corner table, quietly orchestrating his brutal empire while his dark eyes track her every single move across the floor. It was a gaze steeped in the classic cycle of toxic masculinity, blending overwhelming protection with absolute possession. When her grueling shift ends, Emma pushes through the back exit only to find him waiting. He stands beside a sleek black Mercedes with windows so dark they resemble portals to the underworld. "I should really go home," she whispers, her natural survival instincts begging her to run. "Then I will take you home," Alejandro counters. It is late, and the streets are not safe. When she argues that she takes the bus every night, he shuts the rebellion down instantly. "Not tonight." He places his heavy hand on the small of her back, the heat radiating through her cheap uniform. Before she can even form a logical protest, she is guided into the plush leather trap. You and I have probably seen this exact psychological trap before. The interior of the car is a sensory overload, smelling of expensive cologne and ruthless authority. "Where do you live, Emma?" His voice wraps around her, demanding compliance under the guise of care. When they pull up to her grim apartment building, the contrast is staggering. "This neighborhood," he murmurs, his eyes scanning the broken streetlights. "It is not safe for you." "It is what I can afford," she sighs. His jaw tightens, revealing the possessive fury of a man used to buying whatever he wants. "That will change," he vows. "Here is a profound life lesson for us all. True care empowers your independence. It does not seek to own your circumstances." She should have run from that massive red flag immediately. She should have recognized the glaring alarms, warning her of the psychological cage being built around her. Instead, the adrenaline translates entirely into romantic butterflies. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Duca," she whispers softly. "Just Alejandro?" He corrects, stripping away the boundaries. He reaches out, tracing slow, hypnotic circles over her racing pulse until the air grows heavy in her lungs. "And this is not goodbye, Emma. I will see you tomorrow." When she nervously points out that she does not have a shift, his smirk deepens into something lethal. "I know. I will pick you up at 7. Wear something beautiful," before she can question why she is submitting to a crime boss. He presses an object into her trembling palm. It is the physical manifestation of her impending ruin. She stares down at a heavy premium business card bearing nothing but a single phone number embossed in solid gold lettering. "If you need anything before then," Alejandro murmurs, his voice dropping into a register that sends a confusing rush of heat through her veins. "Anything at all. You call this number." She is entirely overwhelmed, offering a mute nod before stumbling out into the damp night air. Once inside her cramped room, She peers through the blinds. The crime boss keeps his vehicle parked at the curb for 20 full minutes, standing guard until her bedroom light finally flicks on. That very night marked the beginning of her absolute descent into his hidden reality. From that moment forward, her humble existence was swallowed by a dizzying blur of organized crime. We all know exactly how these romanticized tragedies conclude. It is a space where lethal consequences and luxury weave together to trap the innocent. Emma lived in a state of constant terror, yet felt more alive than ever, bombarded daily by massive arrangements of exotic flowers. Fast forward to a quiet evening in his fortress-like penthouse. "You do not understand what you are," he whispers, threading his calloused fingers through her hair. "You are pure light in a world of shadows, and I am far too selfish to let the darkness touch you." She studies the face of this terrifyingly beautiful man, searching for an answer to the moral compromise she has already accepted. "Then what does that make you?" she asks softly. The tension in the vast room grows heavy enough to suffocate them. "Your darkness," he replied without hesitation. "I am the monster who will burn the world down to keep you safe. But here is the ultimate life lesson we must take away. You cannot build a peaceful home on a foundation of pure violence. The flames you start will eventually consume you." We are violently pulled back to the present, watching Emma sob into the freezing mud of his grave. On the fateful night his empire collapsed, she was waiting in that very penthouse. His final message was a tragically flawed promise. "I love you. Everything I do is to build a life where you will always be safe." Just 2 hours later, his blood-soaked lieutenant knocked on her door. He delivered the crushing reality that the warehouse was a trap, and the man who promised her the world was gone. Let us examine this scene together. Grief does not negotiate. It arrives like a relentless debt collector, demanding payment from the soul. We find Emma entirely consumed by this toll. All that remains of the feared syndicate leader she loved is a shattered timepiece. His associates attempted to buy her silence with blood money, but she refused the bribe. Now she collapses in the damp earth, weeping that waking up is a daily recurrence of his death. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifts. The downpour carries the distinct fragrance of his signature cologne. She looks up, her reality fracturing at this phantom scent. The lesson here is profound yet simple. The people we love deeply leave an indelible mark on our existence, one that no heavy storm can ever truly wash away. The cinematic imagery is drenched, Zonzoro. Cold rain batters the stone monuments, mirroring the panic tearing through Emma. She attempts to rationalize the terror, convincing herself her fractured psyche is conjuring phantoms to avoid the permanence of his absence. She is shivering and depleted, wanting nothing more than to retreat to her home. But then, a primal sensation pierces the fog. It is that ancient instinct warning her that unseen eyes are tracking her every movement. The atmosphere grows heavy and cold. The essential life lesson to take from this chilling moment is to always honor your intuition. When your instincts scream that danger is near, you must listen, because your body often perceives the hidden truths your rational mind refuses to accept. She turns and spots a massive silhouette looming among the gravestones. The figure possesses the coiled posture of a syndicate enforcer, a physical language of violence she knows far too well. Her breath catches. For one suspended second, her desperate mind projects Alessandro onto this stranger. She breathes his name, caught between impossible hope and psychological collapse. Yet, as the man steps back into the storm, the projection crumbles. It is merely a stranger grieving his own losses. She is left clutching her chest, shattered by the cruel trick of her own desire. The profound takeaway here is about the nature of closure. The hardest lesson we face is learning how to finally release the phantoms of our past so we might truly live in the present. Let us observe the mechanics of this scene. Emma touches the stone, begging forgiveness for failing to save a man who never needed saving. She walks into the tempest, unaware of the twist behind her. The shadow detaches from the darkness, revealing the truth. The syndicate leader is alive, observing her with predatory intensity. He stands at his own grave, orchestrating her grief, like a conductor of psychological torment. She remains blind to him, though her intuition senses the disturbance. The haunting reality is those who consume our hearts rarely release their grip. The essential life lesson here is to remain vigilant. The past is never truly buried. It simply waits in the shadows for the perfect moment to resurrect itself. Emma retreats to an opulent apartment functioning as a high-end mausoleum. The crime boss had masked his possessiveness as protection, rapidly isolating her from her humble beginnings. He constructed a fortress of wealth around her, ensuring her dependence on his empire. Now, dropping her soaked garments upon imported marble floors, she recognizes the architecture of her captivity. A fortress devoid of life is merely a beautifully decorated prison. This isolation highlights a tragic realization about material wealth. The profound lesson to internalize is that all the luxury in the world cannot generate warmth in a vacant home. True security resides entirely in the presence of genuine connection, not in the expensive golden chains someone uses to bind you to their shadow. You and I have likely witnessed this kind of human devastation. The reflection in the mirror is a ghost of the woman she once was. Emma is deteriorating physically, hollowed out by a sorrow reducing her to mere survival. She steps into a blistering shower, seeking physical sensation to combat the numbness. Weeping against the expensive stone, she is trapped in a reality where time feels like a suffocating eternity. Moving with mechanical detachment, she wraps herself in his discarded silk shirt, desperate to inhale his lingering scent before collapsing onto the vast bed. It is a deeply painful truth, but the crucial lesson here is about release. Clinging to the fading artifacts of a painful past will only anchor you permanently in the darkness. True rest is inaccessible to her now. Her mind is a theater of trauma, screening violent nightmares of his demise. When her phone vibrates, she assumes it is a disruption from the service job she maintains simply to tether herself to the ordinary world, using labor as a shield against internal collapse. But as the screen illuminates her face, the ordinary world shatters. An untraceable message warns her that graveside visits are no longer safe. The psychological shock is absolute. This moment introduces a profound reality about human suffering. The essential lesson is that rock bottom is often just an illusion. Just when you believe you have lost everything and the narrative is finished, life will abruptly remind you that the plot can always become dangerously more complex. A tremor overtakes her form as she dissects the text. She tries to categorize the intrusion as a cruel joke, yet the syntax carries the unmistakable authority of the syndicate world. It possesses the exact dictatorial cadence her fallen lover used to wield. With trembling fingers, she demands the identity of her stalker. The suspense stretches as the typing indicator dances and vanishes, delivering a chilling directive to lock her doors, addressing her by name. She is thrust into a psychological tailspin, caught in the crossfire between an impending panic attack and a toxic hope. The overarching life lesson here is delicate. We must be incredibly careful when walking the treacherous tightrope between clinging to impossible miracles and maintaining our anchor to rational reality. Driven by adrenaline, Emma fires back warnings, but the figure remains unfazed. The response states rival factions would harm her merely to strike at them. The grammatical structure is monumental. They used the present tense. It is a slip suggesting her protector is operating in the shadows, fighting an active war. Her heart hammers as she types his name, a digital plea thrown into the void. And then, the most punishing response arrives: absolute silence. She is left suspended in agonizing uncertainty before a final message commands her to forget the exchange. The profound lesson is undeniable. The agonizing silence of unanswered questions is often vastly more destructive to the human soul than confronting the most devastating and brutal truth. Let us examine the moral weight of this together. The digital spectre delivers one final word, bellissima, the precise, intimate moniker the syndicate boss claimed as his own. The device slips from her paralyzed fingers. Emma's logical mind battles this impossible revelation, recalling the warehouse explosion and the finality of a death certificate. But analyze the emotional cruelty embedded in this strategy. If this architect of violence orchestrated his own demise, he chose to let the center of his universe shatter over an empty grave for half a year. Why inflict such torture? Because within the underworld, visibility equals death. The harsh life lesson is that sometimes ensuring the physical survival of the people you cherish most requires you to completely break their hearts. Her mind short-circuits over the possibility that her lover is orchestrating events from the shadows. When the intercom pierces the silence, it is exactly midnight. Emma recoils. The syndicate leader had severed her connections, ensuring she remained isolated in his dark world. Trembling, she approaches the panel. A calculated voice announces a midnight parcel. When she denies entry, the courier counters with chilling obedience, stating his directives mandate immediate delivery. The atmosphere is suffocating. The inescapable lesson here is about the illusion of escape. You can fortify your sanctuary and sever every tie, but your unresolved past possesses an absolute disregard for your readiness when it finally arrives to collect its due. Emma attempts to dismiss the messenger, instructing him to leave the parcel. The refusal is non-negotiable. A signature is required. In that tone, Emma detects the psychological signature of the syndicate, a blend of lethal respect and menace characteristic of his inner circle. Resigning herself, she dresses but retains his silk shirt, draping it over herself like a talisman to ward off the ghosts of his empire. She steps into the silent corridor, every instinct confirming she is walking into a carefully laid snare. Yet, the compulsion for truth overrides her survival instinct. The tragic life lesson here reflects our deepest vulnerabilities. We will willingly walk into a blazing emotional inferno, prepared to turn to ash, just for the fleeting hope of feeling warm again. Let us closely examine the cinematography of this moment. Emma peers through the glass to find a towering enforcer in an immaculate suit. He stands with absolute stillness, holding a black box secured by a silver ribbon. He delivers a disciplined nod, the language of a soldier addressing a superior. Terrified, Emma keeps the chain engaged, demanding his employer's identity. Obscured by dark lenses despite the hour, he radiates the gravity of the underworld. He declines to name his master, yet offers a solemn vow that she has always been perfectly safe. Her strength evaporates at this confirmation. The profound life lesson here is monumental. The devastating truth we desperately seek is often vastly heavier to bear than the comfortable lies we have been carrying. Here is where the narrative shifts from a simple tragedy into a complex psychological thriller. You and I are watching a woman whose entire reality shatters in a single breath. The mysterious stranger offers a ghost of a smile, dropping a line that echoes from the grave. He repeats the exact vow her supposedly dead lover, Alessandro, once used as a shield. "Everything I do is to keep you safe." Emma whispers that he is alive, the words slipping out like a fragile, desperate prayer. The man remains silent, sliding a heavy box through the gap before vanishing into the shadows like smoke. It forces us to realize a difficult truth. Sometimes, the things we believe are gone forever are just waiting in the dark for the exact right moment to return. We are stepping into a vendetta that simply refused to stay buried. Before disappearing into a blacked-out vehicle, the stranger leaves a chilling guarantee that Alessandro is still watching over her. Emma stands completely frozen. Her hands shake as she tears through the tissue paper inside the box, revealing a cold, heavy burner phone. There is only one contact saved in its memory, a single letter A. That initial strikes her with the force of a physical blow, sending her collapsing to the cold marble floor. She clutches the device to her chest, her profound grief mutating into a wild, terrifying hope. It exposes a cruel reality about human resilience. We often build our entire lives around a loss, only to find that hope is a much heavier burden to carry than grief. The psychological framing of this scene is incredibly intense. Emma is caught in a violent storm of blinding rage, overwhelming relief, and profound heartbreak. Beside the phone lies a thick envelope. The moment she recognizes the harsh, aggressive strokes of Alessandro's handwriting, the air leaves her lungs. The note serves as a total confession from the syndicate leader. He begs for forgiveness, insisting he had no choice but to fake his own death to blind his enemies. He admits to watching her weep night after night, bleeding in the shadows to guarantee her survival. The hardest lesson in life is realizing that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are just desperately trying to shield us from an even greater, unspeakable pain. The evidence of his manipulation is written on that page. The Don pours his dark, fractured soul into the letter, anticipating her fury but demanding her trust one last time. He warns that rival predators are still circling in the underworld, eager to destroy her just to watch him bleed. He orders her to keep the phone close as a shadow, promising that if she ever powers it on, he will burn the entire city to the ground to reach her. He frames his vicious lies and the fake funeral as necessary sacrifices for her survival. Emma traces the dark ink 17 times, questioning her own sanity in the silent room. It reveals a terrifying truth we must face. The most profound acts of pure devotion often look exactly like unforgivable acts of massive betrayal. The cinematic tension here relies entirely on her internal conflict. Gripping the heavy phone, Emma feels her mourning instantly curdle into untamed fury. Alessandro is truly out there, well, somewhere, observing her agony like a distant god. She questions whether this was genuine protection or the act of a man treating her as a prized possession. She stumbles through her apartment, throwing every single deadbolt. Half of her mind screams to power on the device and unleash her rage. Yet she understands the screen illuminates. She will be pulled directly back into his toxic gravity. True independence is a fragile thing. Sometimes the absolute hardest choice you can make is refusing to reach out to the hand that built your cage. The physical objects in this scene carry so much narrative weight. Emma shoves the burner device deep into her nightstand, resting it beside the scorched watch she gave him before his staged death. Suddenly, her regular phone vibrates, shattering the heavy silence. An unknown number displays a deeply unsettling message, praising her for keeping the burner dark, but reminding her he is always watching. He casually mentions that his armed enforcers are surrounding her building to ensure she remains perfectly safe. Stick with me here because this is where the romance bleeds into horror. We often look for monsters hiding in dark alleys, forgetting that the absolute most dangerous forces are usually the ones promising to keep us safe from everything else. The camera lingers on the cold reality outside her window. Emma peers down at the street and spots a slick black sedan idling with heavily tinted glass. It begs the question of how many months those men have been parked there, passively watching her mourn an empty grave. A rational mind might flee to the authorities to report this syndicate surveillance. However, 6 months of relentless grief has hardened her mental armor. There is a bizarre reassurance in knowing that a ruthless phantom is moving chess pieces in the dark to ensure her survival. It reveals a strange quirk of human nature. When we are pushed to our absolute limits, the very things that should completely terrify us can somehow become our only source of dark, twisted comfort. This sequence perfectly captures the suffocating nature of her new reality. Sliding under the blankets, Emma makes a highly dangerous vow. She will uncover exactly what kind of syndicate war Alessandro is shielding her from, even if the truth destroys her. Morning breaks, casting shadows across her floor that look distinctly like the bars of a prison cell. The burner phone rests inside her drawer like a loaded revolver, carrying enough explosive secrets to burn her entire life to the ground. She forces down bitter coffee that tastes entirely like ash. Honestly, life rarely gives us a warning before it completely shatters our reality. We simply wake up on an unremarkable Tuesday to find the solid ground beneath our feet has fundamentally changed forever. Let us look at this together, because we have all felt that chilling moment when a sanctuary morphs into a cell. Emma gazes at the street, finding the black sedan has not moved an inch. In the harsh daylight, she spots 2 massive enforcers sitting motionless as stone statues. The Don insists this is protection, but in his underworld, protection and captivity are identical twins. Unable to endure the suffocating silence of her apartment, she grabs a jacket to escape. Yet, before her hand even brushes the doorknob, her phone buzzes. Where are you going? He is monitoring her every breath. True freedom is an absolute illusion if someone else holds the keys, and it takes genuine courage to finally look at the iron bars and call them exactly what they are. The architecture of his control is entirely invisible but absolute, a web stretching across the whole city. Emma types back that she simply needs some fresh air. His reply arrives instantly. He instructs her to take the car, stating she no longer walks alone in this territory. A bitter laugh escapes her as she types back that she has been completely alone for 6 months. The screen illuminates with his response, reminding her she only thought she was alone and commanding her to use the driver. She aches to rebel, yet she knows his armored wolves will stalk her either way. We eventually learn that fighting a massive storm directly only drains our strength. True survival sometimes means stepping into the heavy rain and waiting patiently for the worst to pass. The sheer audacity of his manipulation is masterful. Emma texts back that she will take the car on the condition that she dictates the destination. He smoothly replies that she has always had a choice, claiming he never forced her hand. That massive lie nearly pushes her into hysterical laughter. He pulled her deep into his bloody syndicate and completely rewired her reality with his toxic affection. She steps out into the crisp air and the heavy sedan door swings open. The driver is not a random enforcer, but a silver-haired gentleman who greets her with an unsettling, familial warmth. It is frightening how easily we surrender our own power when someone paints our complete submission in the beautiful, deeply intoxicating colors of grand romance. The twisted logic of the underworld is on full display here. Dante, the veteran hitman, respectfully bows his head, telling Emma it has been a profound honor keeping her safe. She refuses to accept the framing, snapping back that he has simply been stalking her. Dante softly corrects her, revealing that faking his own death practically destroyed Alessandro's soul, but the rival families would have gladly used her blood to break him. Smelling her dead lover's signature cologne lingering in the leather seats, Emma bitterly mutters that everyone has a choice. Dante merely shakes his head, stating that men like him do not. Here is a real lesson. The higher you climb the ladder of power, the fewer choices you actually retain for the people you love most. The absolute core of toxic syndicate loyalty is exposed right here. Dante quietly explains that a man does whatever it takes to keep his people breathing. Everything else is merely collateral damage, even if the lie completely wrecks the person being saved. Emma locks eyes with him in the rearview mirror, seeing nothing but unbreakable devotion to the ghost, puppeteering her daily life. When Dante asks for their destination, she desperately wants to visit the cemetery to scream at his empty grave. Yet she knows Alessandro is watching, and crying at his headstone is exactly the tragic performance he expects. Take this advice to heart. True rebellion is not always about making noise. Sometimes the best way to fight back is refusing to play the part written for you. Emma shatters the script, demanding a detour to the rotting fisherman's harbor. It is a brilliant move. This is the exact place her billionaire boss would avoid. He kept her preserved in a suffocating bubble of luxury, a gilded cage masking the bloody machinery of his mafia empire. Dante says nothing, steering the heavy sedan away from the glittering skyline. Emma watches the glass towers dissolve into rusted warehouses that wear their decay like old battle scars. Until the fog-choked harbor swallows the horizon, she is deliberately bursting her protective bubble. Genuine growth always exacts a harsh toll of discomfort. If you truly want to perceive the reality of your situation, you must be willing to abandon your most comfortable cages. Let us examine this scene together. Emma bolts from the vehicle before Dante even shifts into park, desperate for a single breath of independence. The freezing wind hits her like a physical blow, carrying the harsh stench of salt fish guts and burning diesel fuel. This is gritty reality, a violent contrast to Alessandro and his suffocating high life. Dante remains glued to the sedan, eyes scanning the docks with the paranoia of a seasoned bodyguard. Emma steps to the water's edge, watching the battered boats rise and fall with the dark waves. It is a deeply human instinct to stand on the edge of the world, hoping the dark tide will wash our heavy mistakes away. But the past is a relentless hunter. Right on cue, her phone erupts with an incoming message. The chilling detail is that the message arrives on her everyday phone. A phantom number states she chose her location well, noting he never brought her to the harbor due to the open sniper sight lines. Emma spins around, her pulse hammering, frantically scanning the rusted rooftops for the glint of a scope. Anger overtaking fear, she texts back that he deserves to drown in the exact same agony he forced upon her. The crime boss replies instantly. He claims he watched her weep over his empty grave without being able to reach out. The psychological control is suffocating. It reveals a devastating truth about holding on to pain. The hardest lesson of grief is that sometimes the very ghosts we mourn are the ones quietly watching us break from the shadows. The syndicate leader fires back, insisting he suffered as he watched her wither away. Tears blurring her vision, Emma demands to know why he let her believe he was rotting in the earth. A heavy silence falls over the exchange. You can feel the mobster calculating how much darkness to unveil. Finally, he confesses his enemies are artists of torture. If she knew he drew breath, the rival syndicate would have recognized the hope in her eyes and torn her apart. The hunters are the Russo family, his father's oldest adversaries. This brings us to a harsh reality about human connection. Attempting to shield someone by keeping massive secrets almost always orchestrates a much larger disaster, no matter how pure your intentions might be. Alessandro types that his enemies waited decades for him to value something beyond the criminal empire. By loving Emma, he handed his rivals a loaded weapon. Emma replies that his deception destroyed them instead. Alessandro counters with a freezing dose of reality. He did not destroy her life, he preserved it. Emma wants to hurl the device into the freezing water, yet her knuckles grip it like a lifeline. She demands his location, and his answer is chilling. He is 30 seconds away if danger strikes, but distant enough to let her rage burn. Consider the dark poetry here. It is a wildly cruel irony that the most suffocating cages we find ourselves trapped in are often forged by the exact people who fiercely claim they love us the most. Emma refuses to surrender, declaring that having an armed shadow tracking her every breath is a prison, not a sanctuary. Alessandro meets her anger with devastating honesty. He admits he never offered her freedom. He only provided safety, an all-consuming obsession, and zero choices. He types a line that should freeze her blood. Loving her is the last human fragment inside his hollowed-out soul, and he will never apologize for violently protecting what belongs to him. A rational person would sprint to the authorities after being labeled a possession. Yet, we must confront an uncomfortable truth about desire. Sometimes, in our deepest unlit corners, we secretly yearn to belong to someone willing to burn the entire world down just to keep us safe. Emma realizes with horror that a fractured piece of her actually craves his suffocating obsession. Fighting her instincts, she types that she is not a mere possession. His reply is toxic poetry. She is his heart beating outside his chest, the reason he faked his demise, and losing her terrifies him more than a bullet. Suddenly, the foggy silence shatters. Violent chaos erupts near the rusted warehouses. Harsh Italian commands cut through the air, followed by screaming tires and a rifle shot that cracks like a snapping spine. Dante transforms into a blur of motion, hauling her toward the getaway vehicle. There is a very pragmatic lesson to learn here. When a professional enforcer tells you it is time to move, you abandon your questions and simply run for your life. Emma screams over the deafening noise, demanding answers. Dante shifts into cold survival mode, barking at her to keep moving. Gunfire shreds the thick fog, sending dock workers scattering like panicked birds. Dante shoves her into the back seat and floors the accelerator, the heavy engine roaring as they violently peel away. Amidst this chaotic escape, her secret burner phone finally rings. Her shaking hands fumble to answer it. Alessandro's real voice fills the car, heavy, with a terrifying mixture of mafia rage and desperate fear as he asks if she is bleeding. She chokes out that Dante got her clear. The takeaway here is deeply grounding. When the structures of your life violently collapse, the people who truly value your existence will always be the very first ones reaching through the rubble. Emma begs the speaker to explain the madness. Alessandro's voice drops to a lethal growl. It is the Russo syndicate. They were stalking her, testing if his assassination was a bluff. Through the phone, you hear the grim symphony of a mob war. Heavy boots pounding pavement, harsh, tactical commands, and the terrifying metallic click of rifles being chambered. Alessandro barks a command for Dante to secure her at the safe house. Fighting for autonomy, Emma argues back, demanding clarity instead of another hiding spot. The boss cuts her off, asking if she prefers to stay breathing with a tone of unyielding ice. It is a brutal but necessary reminder. Demanding the truth in the center of a raging fire will only guarantee you burn. You must secure your survival before demanding answers. Alessandro dictates she will follow his orders so he can destroy the threat. Emma frantically asks what he intends to do. A bone-chilling silence stretches across the connection. When he speaks, his voice is a dark whisper. He notes his enemies hunted for the truth until that truth became a loaded weapon. He then strips away all romantic illusions, promising to violently protect what belongs to him by any means necessary. The phones go dead. Sitting in the Chateau's back seat, Emma catches Dante's eyes in the rearview mirror. She prayed for her lover's return, only to realize Chassis summoned a merciless monster from the grave. Let this serve as a profound warning. Be deeply mindful of what you dig for. Unearthing buried secrets often means waking a vicious beast you can never put back to sleep. Emma is paralyzed by the violent shadow, reclaiming her. She expects a bleak concrete bunker with heavy steel doors. Instead, Dante escorts her into a jaw-dropping penthouse high above the financial district. Framed by floor-to-ceiling glass and expensive art, the space is a monument to arrogant wealth rather than a fortress of fear. Dante mentions the boss owns the entire skyscraper. As they walk inside, Dante instinctively lets his hand hover just inches behind her spine. It is the exact hyper-vigilant protective gesture Alessandro used, and seeing it replicated shatters her fragile heart. This reveals a brilliant psychological truth. Sometimes the most agonizing ghosts we are forced to carry are simply the quiet habits left behind by the people we thought had vanished forever. Notice the suffocating security keeping her inside. Nobody enters this tower without rigorous biometrics and Alessandro's authorization. The elevator requires a retinal sweep, a thumbprint, and a 16-digit code. They ride up in silence, watching the city shrink into a toy maze. Emma stands at the window, eyes fixed on the black smoke, rising from the exact harbor they just fled. Distant police sirens paint the bloody pier. She asks Dante how long she must remain locked inside this golden cage. Looking utterly exhausted, he simply replies she will stay as long as it takes. The lesson here is deeply sobering. Escaping one violent storm often just means you are forced to sit quietly inside another, holding your breath until the sky finally clears. Let us examine the architecture of this psychological prison. Dante assures Emma that the syndicate boss will arrive once the shadows clear, revealing a penthouse stocked with bespoke garments and her exact preferences. Alessandro orchestrates her existence with the suffocating precision he applies to his crime family. By all metrics, Emma should be enraged, yet a profound emotional paralysis has taken hold. 6 months of mourning and illusion have left her hollowed out. The phantom echoes of mob gunfire still vibrating in her subconscious. As Dante stands guard, we are reminded of a quiet truth. The most devastating exhaustion does not come from physical trauma, but from carrying the crushing weight of a heavy emotional burden entirely on your own. You and I must pause to unpack the sheer pathology of this environment. As Dante secures the heavy reinforced doors, Emma is left to wander this opulent penthouse like a spectre haunting her own life. She opens the expansive wardrobe only to discover a meticulously curated museum of her personal aesthetic. We are talking flawless cashmere and perfectly tailored denim assembled by a phantom who catalogued her every preference. He even sourced her obscure facial creams and preferred toothbrush. It forces us to ask how many months he spent choreographing his own demise just to seal her in this luxurious vault. We all crave being deeply understood, but we learn that an obsession with absolute protection can easily mutate into the most suffocating trap of all. The visual framing here is dripping with tragic irony. Emma stands isolated in the cavernous kitchen, her hands trembling as she unearths a bottle of rare vintage. It is the exact label they shared on quiet evenings before the mafia violence swallowed them whole. Pouring a glass, she gazes through the glass at a vibrant metropolis she is forbidden to touch. As the hours agonizingly stretch and the sky bruises into twilight, her mind spirals. She visualizes him out in the darkness, systematically dismantling the Russo syndicate with cold brutality. He eradicated her freedom simply to guarantee her survival. It is a haunting realization that the heaviest chains we drag through life are often forged by the exact people desperately trying to keep us safe. The cinematic tension in this moment is masterfully constructed. As the urban landscape below transforms into a sea of artificial constellations, Emma surrenders to the inevitability of another desolate night. Yet, without warning, the mechanical hum of the private elevator shatters the suffocating silence. The steel doors slide apart, and her nervous system immediately goes into shock. Emerging from the shadows is Alessandro Duca, the apex predator of the underworld, entirely resurrected. The miracle she wept for over 6 agonizing months is standing within arm's reach, his features hollowed out by exhaustion and violence. It is a profound psychological paradox. Receiving the exact impossible miracle you begged the universe for can be significantly more terrifying than the silence of unanswered prayers. Notice the visual contrast of Alessandro stepping into this immaculate sanctuary, clad entirely in dark tactical armor. Emma immediately registers the flaking blood coating his knuckles, a grim confirmation that another human was sacrificed to secure her breath. They remain locked, in a paralyzing standoff, the atmosphere thick with the oppressive electricity that precedes a storm. When the mob boss finally speaks her name, the low resonance of his voice obliterates her psychological armor. She is violently torn between collapsing against his chest and striking him for the agony he orchestrated. Clutching her glass, she can only whisper her disbelief of his survival. The quiet tragedy of outlasting a profound trauma is the daily, grueling battle of convincing your own nervous system that the nightmare has actually ended. The power dynamic shifts as the syndicate leader advances with the cautious steps of a predator cornering a wounded animal. He openly acknowledges the hatred she must harbor, but Emma shatters that assumption with devastating honesty. She confesses the toxic truth of her psyche. Her true hatred is directed at herself for remaining hopelessly devoted to the architect of her destruction. Hearing this, the impenetrable armor of the ruthless Don crumbles, exposing a profound vulnerability as he invokes an old term of endearment. She recoils, demanding he stop weaponizing the ghosts of their past. Yet, He vehemently insists their bond was always authentic. We are forced to confront a brutal reality here. True love is rarely a sanctuary, and our most permanent scars are usually inflicted by the ones bleeding to protect us. Let us examine this psychological collision together. He maintains their romance was absolute, and the only deception was his fabricated funeral. This admission breaks the dam of her composure. She screams that standing over his empty casket pushed her sanity to the brink, surviving only to honor a ghost. She accuses him of passively observing her torment. That accusation strikes a volatile nerve. Alessandro lowers his voice into a chilling register. He was not idle. Over 6 months, he systematically slaughtered 17 rival soldiers and reduced their empire to ashes to sanitize her world. It illustrates how true sacrifice is rarely a clean act of heroism. Often, it is simply executing the most horrifying deeds in the shadows, just to guarantee someone else sees the dawn. While the legitimate world mourned an empty grave, the mastermind waged an invisible war to ensure she could never be weaponized against him. Emma completely fractures under the weight of this revelation. She shatters her crystal glass against the marble, the vintage wine pooling like arterial blood. She violently rejects his crusade, screaming that she never demanded a trail of corpses, only his authentic self, regardless of the peril. Alessandro breaches her personal space, carrying the visceral scent of burnt gunpowder. He coldly dismantles her naive idealism. If she possessed the truth, the Russo Syndicate would have methodically destroyed her just to shatter his mind. We must eventually realize that our most innocent intentions mean absolutely nothing the second they collide with the ruthless mechanics of a dark reality. We must analyze the terrifying calculus of his logic. He understood Emma lacked the conditioning to conceal her relief, making her a liability. Seeking distance, she drives her palms against his chest, yet her biology betrays her outrage. Her hands simply rest against him, absorbing the undeniable proof of his heartbeat. She condemns his arrogance, accusing him of playing a cruel deity by sealing her inside a gilded birdcage and labeling it devotion. He offers no defense and, covering her trembling hands with his blood-stained fingers, he unapologetically owns the architecture of her prison, asserting the only alternative was her total annihilation. It is a deeply unsettling lesson, but sometimes fierce love has nothing to do with freedom. It is entirely about preserving a heartbeat, even if that heart beats only to despise you. The syndicate leader completely embraces his own monstrosity. He states with terrifying clarity that he would rather chain her to the earth, furious and breathing, than lay flowers on her grave. Her death is the singular vulnerability that could dismantle him. Reaching out with striking gentleness, he brushes a tear from her cheek. He operates under no delusions of nobility. He is a monster by every standard, but Emma remains the solitary grace his corrupted hands have ever held. He was prepared to absorb her infinite hatred if it secured her pulse. Hearing this, Emma collapses into devastating sobs, confessing she cannot sustain this agonizing existence. It is a profound tragedy when the exact methods deployed to ensure your physical survival silently mutate into the heavy walls of your own psychological prison. Stick with me, because the power structure is about to flip. Emma is paralyzed by the dread of waking up to find him erased from her reality once more. Sensing this absolute terror, Alessandro executes the most unnatural maneuver for a possessive crime lord. He releases his grip. Stepping back, he surrenders the passcode to the private elevator, December 4th, 2024. It is the precise date he recognized his consuming devotion to her. He provides a clean vehicle, untraceable funds, and a vow of eternal absence. Emma simply stares, frantically searching his deadened eyes for a hidden snare. The ultimate paradox of control is that the most terrifying action a captor can take is swinging the gilded door wide open. Real devotion requires handing someone the absolute power to leave you and trusting them anyway. There is zero manipulation lurking in his gaze. Emma finds only a suffocating exhaustion and a grim resignation mirroring a dead man. She breathes a whisper of shock, unable to process that after an apocalyptic war, the ruthless Don is legitimately offering her the exit. Alessandro clenches his jaw, warring against the agonizing instinct to claim her. He confesses the theft of her peace, offering this terrifying freedom as his ultimate atonement. Yet, he issues a chilling ultimatum. If she refuses the door, she accepts the eternal darkness of his syndicate. He will always remain a dangerously obsessive force, loving her with a violent magnitude. True wisdom materializes only when we accept human beings exactly as they are, finally surrendering the toxic fantasy that our sheer devotion will magically rewrite their fundamental nature. Let's look at this opening image together. The city glitters beyond the glass, cold and indifferent, while the brutal Russo crime family plots their next move. Inside this high-rise fortress, Emma faces a man who faked his own death out of a twisted sense of devotion. She ignores his ultimatum, demanding the truth about the harbor shootout. In an instant, Alessandro shifts. The vulnerable lover vanishes, replaced by the icy king of the underworld. He reveals that Russo hitmen were tracking her, waiting to pull her off the street. His response was absolute. He slaughtered them first, without hesitation. It leaves us with a stark reality. In an unforgiving world, hesitation is the fastest way to lose the ones we cherish most. We must fiercely protect our peace, no matter the cost. Notice the absolute lack of remorse in his posture. Alessandro doesn't even blink as he calmly confesses to executing all four men. He shipped their bodies directly to Dimitri Russo, delivering a visceral message. Looking at Emma is a signed death warrant. When Emma stammers that breaking his cover ruins his master plan, Alessandro dismisses it entirely. Remaining a ghost holds no value if it means allowing her to walk into a snare. The Russo syndicate will soon learn that Alessandro Duca breathes, and he is coming for them. He has ignited an open, bloody war, and she is the single spark that started the fire. It forces us to reflect on our own priorities. Eventually, we all need to find that one profound thing worth burning our carefully constructed world to the ground for. By all logic, Emma should have sprinted for the elevator. But as she studies this lethal figure, a man who has killed, deceived, and metaphorically died for her, she realizes her anchor was dropped long ago. Stepping into his space, her voice lowers to a murmur. She demands a single promise. A desperate flare of hope illuminates his exhausted eyes, and he offers her the world. Her terms are shockingly grounded. No more deception, no more orchestrated tragedies. If danger approaches, he must face her with the unvarnished reality. She refuses to be a mere pawn in this violent chess match. Sometimes, the only way to survive a chaotic environment is to look the shadows directly in the eye and demand the brutal truth. That is how genuine loyalty is forged. She makes it clear that if a storm is coming, they must stand in the rain together. She refuses the safety of ignorance, warning him that protective secrecy will destroy her faster than any rival bullet. Closing the distance, she issues her final ultimatum: promise absolute truth, or she walks out forever. Alessandro studies her, a violent internal war raging behind his eyes. His primal instinct to shield her clashes violently with the paralyzing terror of her absence. Finally, the iron walls of the Mafia boss crumble. He nods, swearing a heavy oath of total transparency, the good, the bad, and the deeply tragic. Emma rests her palm against his rough cheek, fully accepting his darkness. We learn here that radical acceptance is the most powerful anchor we can offer a damaged soul. This moment serves as the emotional climax of their fractured dynamic. Emma looks at the man she loves and quietly drops a devastating revelation. She always knew he was alive. Hearing this, Alessandro breaks entirely, pulling her into a crushing embrace. His chest heaves as the massive fortress of deception he built completely collapses inward. The ruthless king of the underworld buries his face in her hair, his tears hot and jagged against her skin. He begs for forgiveness, agonizing over the fact that he watched her grieve from the cold shadows. They are just two shattered souls, clinging to one another above a city waiting to burn. The profound lesson here is that true healing only begins the exact moment we stop hiding our vulnerabilities behind heavy walls of deception. Rebuilding ruined trust is like trying to gather spilled water with your bare hands. It demands agonizing patience. When Alessandro kisses her, the moment tastes of salt, iron, and a desperate hunger. Emma realizes then that some cages can feel comforting, provided you understand exactly why the steel door was locked. But peace is an illusion here. Just 3 days after he steps out of the grave, the Russo family strikes back with vengeance. A deafening blast rips through a crowded restaurant, one of his legitimate businesses. Innocent families are entirely swallowed by the sudden fire. 12 broken bodies, 3 lives extinguished. It serves as a brutal reminder that the innocent always pay the heaviest toll in a war they never asked to fight. The television glow paints the dark penthouse in erratic flashes. Emma stands paralyzed, absorbing the horrific bombing footage. Alessandro looms behind her, manifesting as a literal shadow of wrath, barking ruthless commands into his phone. His heavy hand clamps onto her shoulder, an anchor of possession while his sprawling empire catches fire. He growls, his voice dripping with malice, explaining that the Russos are trying to make him with grief. Emma turns to study him, witnessing the terrifying duality of the man. He is a cold executioner moving pawns toward inevitable death, yet beneath that monstrous facade is merely an exhausted human. The profound lesson here is simple. The monsters we fear most are often just men deeply terrified of losing the only light they have left. Stick with me here, because the psychological warfare is deepening. You and I both know what unbridled anger does to a person. It makes us functionally blind. Alessandro understands this fundamental truth. His jaw tightens as he explains to Emma that blind fury never wins a war. Only merciless, detached strategy secures a victory. He leads her to a heavy oak table buried in maps and surveillance photos, forming a makeshift altar to his enemy's sins. We learn Dmitri Russo has 3 sons. Victor moves the narcotics. Alex is the sadistic enforcer. And then there's the youngest, Mickey, the so-called golden child, supposedly safe at Oxford. The life lesson here is crucial. Never let wild, emotional anger cloud your vision when cold, calculated strategy is what truly wins the game. A slow smile creeps across Alessandro's face, cold and devoid of light. He reveals the fatal flaw in the Russo bloodline. Young Mickey harbors a raging gambling addiction, bleeding money at underground tables. Worse still, the boy is actively stealing from his father to cover his debts. Alessandro just delivered the proof directly to Dimitri's doorstep. Emma stares at the glossy photographs of a 20-year-old sweating at velvet tables, surrounded by bookies who quietly answer to Alessandro. The stark horror washes over her. He is weaponizing a father against his own flesh and blood. Alessandro softly corrects her, noting he is simply offering Dimitri a choice. Remember, the toxic secrets we try hardest to hide are exactly what our enemies will use to orchestrate our downfall. Dimitri must execute his youngest son or surrender his pride. Either way, the Russo dynasty is about to consume itself. It is a terrifyingly brilliant power play, highlighting the cruelty that cemented Alessandro as an underworld legend. Emma realizes with a sinking heart that she is now fully complicit. She sits at his table of ruin, silently blessing the bloodshed orchestrated in her honor. She whispers, asking if this psychological trap will hold. Alessandro's response is chilling. He knows Dimitri loves his boys, but the man loves power far more. When a king realizes his own blood robbing him, paternal love turns to ash. He will sacrifice the boy to maintain dominance. The ultimate lesson here, an obsession with unchecked power will always devour everything you claim to deeply love. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? You and I are witnessing a perfectly orchestrated disaster unfold. Manipulated financial records materialize on Dimitri's desk, while toxic rumors spread like wildfire through the syndicate. Meanwhile, Emma receives a brutal education in underworld survival. Hitters march through their penthouse at all hours, trading hushed secrets for sanctioned kill orders. She lives with the suffocating dread that a sniper's bullet could shatter their glass walls at any second. Alessandro is running on nothing but dark coffee and a violent need to keep her breathing, ignoring her pleas for him to rest. The lesson here is profound yet simple. When you try to protect your world from falling apart, you inevitably sacrifice your own peace of mind in the process. Emma finds him staring out the glass windows, glaring at the city he controls through fear. He refuses to turn around, his voice wrecked from exhaustion. He confesses that the second he closes his eyes, violent nightmares take over. He is trapped at the harbor, vividly imagining what would have happened if his men had been a second too late. He pictures her being dragged into the dark to mentally break him. The invincible underworld boss actually chokes on his words, admitting he could not survive that reality. So, he punishes himself with agonizing insomnia. Emma steps up, wrapping her arms tightly around his rigid spine, anchoring him to the present. The real lesson is that the hardest individuals carry the heaviest fears, proving nobody is truly bulletproof when love is involved. As Alejandro leaned into her warmth, the frost covering his spirit refused to melt. He whispered into the quiet night, confessing that another rival would inevitably rise. There would always be a hungry predator circling his territory. Loving a syndicate boss guaranteed a grim existence behind bulletproof glass, shadowed by endless paranoia. For the 100th time, he asked if she truly wanted this waking nightmare. Her resolve held firm. She chose him, embracing the darkness as the cost of admission. When Alejandro finally turned to cradle her face, those same ruthless hands that had dismantled empires were visibly trembling. He murmured that she deserved a safer existence. We learn, often the hard way, that genuine love rarely chooses the easy path. She just kissed him, cementing her place in a beautifully tragic destiny. Stick with me here, because this is the moment the tension finally shatters. He kissed her with a terrifying hunger, merging deep fear with a violently dark loyalty. They pressed against the cold glass, their shadows stretching over a city of enemies. She had fully surrendered to the chaos of a romance built on fresh violence and total trust. 14 days into Alejandro's brutal purge, the endgame arrived. Dmitri begged for a truce. They met on neutral ground in a quiet hotel suite. Alejandro walked in flanked by heavy enforcers, with Emma anchored right beside him. They found Dmitri reduced to a hollow ghost, desperately gripping a rotting legacy. The vital truth here is that the only way to truly bury your worst demons is to walk straight into their den and face them head-on. Dmitri was the portrait of absolute ruin. Slumped with hollow eyes that had ordered countless executions, he studied Emma with disgust. To his archaic mind, a woman was merely a gambling chip. He mocked her worth, questioning if she justified a catastrophic syndicate war. Alejandro's grip on her waist tightened like a steel vice. In a lethal whisper, he promised to tear out the old man's tongue if he spoke out of turn again. Dmitri just offered a joyless, empty laugh. He confessed to his absolute defeat. The psychological poison had worked flawlessly. Staring blankly ahead, Dmitri delivered a chilling confession. He had just strangled his own son with his bare hands. The brutal truth we must accept is that carrying a blind, consuming hatred will always destroy the person holding it first. Witnessing this broken father was chilling. His remaining men were paralyzed with fear, anticipating violence from their own boss as his empire bled out. Alejandro stared at the fractured kin and delivered a freezing verdict. He explained that he had burned the Russo legacy to the ground for one reason. The underworld needed to know that Emma was untouchable. Just looking at her guaranteed a massacre. Dmitri ground his teeth, swallowing his defeat. Then he leaned forward like a dying serpent, preparing one final strike. He swore that when Alejandro grew old, the ghosts of the Russo bloodline would rise up to drag his soul to hell. The lesson here is, undeniable. Building your life on a foundation of vengeance ensures you will spend your remaining days looking over your shoulder. Alejandro did not blink at the curse. He pulled Emma tight against his ribs and made a chilling vow. He promised to slaughter every Russo until the earth choked on their bones, daring the old Don to test his cruelty. A suffocating silence flooded the room. You could feel the brutal collision between exhausted, old guard violence and ruthless new ambition. It was a standoff between two apex predators on the edge of a cliff. With a grim nod, Dmitri told Alejandro to savor his victory, then walked out. The second the lock clicked, Alejandro's iron posture crumbled. He collapsed into Emma's embrace, burying his face in her neck to exhale a breath he had held for weeks. The takeaway is deeply human. Even the most hardened, untouchable leaders require a quiet sanctuary to finally lay down their armor. You and I have probably wished for a clean, cinematic resolution to our problems, but reality rarely provides a blank slate. Emma gazed up at the fierce king who had incinerated a city to protect her, asking if they were finally free. Alejandro stroked her cheek, confessing that permanent peace is a myth in their brutal underworld. There would always be fresh rivals waiting in the dark. However, this specific vendetta was over. Later that evening, he brought her out of hiding, returning to their original penthouse. It was the exact place where she once waited for a dead man to return. The air still carried the scent of rich mahogany, looking completely untouched. Yet the two souls crossing that threshold had been fundamentally altered. The lesson here is profound. Surviving a consuming fire will permanently change the architecture of who you are. Let us step into the shadows, because the psychological twist hits hard right here. Alejandro led Emma to a locked room she was never allowed to enter. The door swung open, revealing a wall plastered with surveillance photos, hundreds of images. Shots of Emma breaking down at his fake grave, wandering rainy streets, and sleeping in isolation. He had constructed a silent shrine out of pure obsession. Dropping his voice to a whisper, he confessed that this was the exact monster he had warned her about. While she mourned him for 6 months, he monitored her every move. He simply could not let her go, refusing to trust anyone else with her safety. He knew it was unhinged, but she was his entire world. Slowly, Emma reached out, tracing her fingers over the cold paper. The profound lesson is terrifying. Sometimes extreme devotion and total madness wear the exact same mask. Her fingers lingered on a photograph of her collapse at his headstone. When Alejandro spoke, his ironclad voice fractured. He confessed that watching her shatter from afar had gutted him. Yet, he could not compromise his false death. The tactical danger was too immense, so he stayed buried in the shadows, orchestrating the destruction of any rival who looked her way. Most people would have sprinted away from this room, recognizing this wall as terrifying possession masquerading as romance. But as Emma analyzed this twisted monument, a profound epiphany washed over her. They were mirror reflections of a beautiful disaster, both deeply fractured, both entirely willing to incinerate their own souls to guarantee the other's survival. The emotional lesson we find here is undeniably raw. Sometimes, two violently broken pieces can align to form a perfect, unshakable whole. Let us be honest, this dynamic was far from a fairy tale. It was messy, psychologically dark, and undeniably real. Emma realized she was permanently bound to the intense gravity of his devotion. She ordered him to tear the photos down. She promised he would never need hidden cameras again because she was right in front of him. Locking her gaze with his, she established an unbreakable rule. The era of hiding in the shadows was dead. If he wanted to protect her, he would do it standing openly at her side. They would face the darkness together, or not at all. Alejandro pulled her fiercely against his chest, a visible tremor betraying his iron exterior. A ruthless boss who had buried his humanity was suddenly drowning in a wave of raw emotion. The lesson is absolute. True connection demands complete vulnerability, even from the most lethal people on earth. He whispered they would never be parted again, forging a pact to anchor their violent future. They found a bizarre peace in that room, surrounded by the photos he was about to burn. Emma unlocked a profound truth. Freedom is found in the radical acceptance of exactly who we are. She chose this lethal man, the perilous lifestyle, and a romance that could burn them both. Yet, wrapped in his arms while city lights cast shadows across their skin, she finally felt at home. 3 months later, they stood before an officiant, accompanied only by a few armed loyalists. There was no white gown or grand cathedral. It was a raw, blood-deep vow of mutual surrender. Just before the final words were spoken, Alejandro gently asked if she was certain. The takeaway is clear. Sometimes your true home is not a quiet sanctuary, but a profoundly complicated person. Pay close attention, because this is where their world shifts on its axis. The syndicate boss looks her dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He flat out tells her that walking away is no longer a possibility. He claims her for this lifetime and whatever dark afterlife awaits them. How does she respond? She grabs his lapels and pulls him into a fierce kiss, whispering that she belonged to him the second they first met. This ceremony is merely ink validating a dangerous truth they were already living. Stepping into this empire is a grueling reality. You must fight for your peace every single morning. Yet, she embraced the cold weight of a loaded firearm, reigning over the underworld like a genuine queen. The concluding lesson is profound. Sometimes, taking the most terrifying risks imaginable will build the exact life you were always destined to rule. We often view powerful men as fortresses, but even this ruthless boss had to face a quiet reckoning. He had to surrender the heavy keys to his darkest traumas. Keeping a partner in the shadows under the guise of protection is never armor. It is a fatal miscalculation. When suffocating night terrors gripped him, leaving him gasping at the phantom image of her death, she became the anchor tethering him to reality. She held him through the dark, promising to dismantle any threat side by side. Months later, standing in their penthouse with a new legacy growing within her, a profound realization takes hold. Sometimes a cage is not a punishment. The simple lesson we find here is that the very walls we construct to keep the violent chaos of the world at bay are the exact same barriers that keep our loved ones fiercely protected inside. Alessandro built a fortress out of raw, terrifying obsession, masking it as mere protection. To anyone watching, this looked like total madness, a suffocating grip on a helpless victim. But let us look at this together. Emma was never the prey. She walked into the dead center of that guarded sanctuary without a blink of hesitation. She pulled the heavy iron door shut, turned the lock with her own hands, and tossed the key into the abyss. It is a brilliant reversal of power. The quiet lesson to carry with you is this: when you find the rare soul who truly understands your most jagged scars, surrendering control does not mean you have lost the battle. It simply means you have finally come home. They locked the world out entirely. Two ruined people, finally whole.